working with arrays doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be hard, but it does require us to learn a little bit of different syntax. Now, the document that's been provided is going to go through a bunch of things that I'll progressively uncomment, and then we can talk about what they do. But for now, I have my basic code here. In this shell document, it has the window onload init, then calls that init function after all the elements in the page have been loaded. I elected not to use that shell as part of it and instead put my script at the bottom, just because then I don't have to have my indents going quite as far. Otherwise, my indents are that much further in, because then everything I typed would be appearing pretty much inside these curly braces here, and I just didn't want to do that. But we can look at that as our projects grow in complexity, where we have to make sure we are using loading properly and making sure all of our assets are loaded before we try and access them. But as long as I put my script at the end before my close body, close HTML, that guarantees everything has been loaded before it gets to my script and runs my script. That's the beauty of putting your script at the end. We will be looking at sticking our script into an external file later, but not right now. So with this, if I run this document, it's going to spit out a message after I specify its build type. It's going to spit out a message, and it will say my h1 arrays, and then it will say nothing yet. So when I look at that, we can see it's grabbing my output using its ID, get element by ID, and then it's setting the inner HTML to nothing yet, so then that gives us the nothing yet. I put that there just so I can prove to myself that output is indeed grabbing this paragraph and is then able to change the HTML content contained. So it's modifying the HTML content of the text node of my paragraph to be completely correct in my syntax there. So now we're going to add a little bit more in. So I'm going to have a message, and that message I'm going to then be setting outputs inner HTML equal to that message momentarily. Now what I'm going to do is create an array. And the way to think of an array is just simply a collection of items. So it's a list of items, collection of items, whatever vocabulary word makes sense to you. But it's a grouping of things, and then they're stored inside the array, the list of items, and we then are able to access them by referencing their place or position within that array. So the very first item in that array, and my array is planets, the very first item, I say planets 0 inside square brackets, and then I set it equal to, and now I use the planet Mercury. So I'm able to specify which place in the array and then what is going to be there. Now, one thing about this is JavaScript does not require me to specify how many items are in my array. It's a dynamic array that can have as many or as few or no items as I see fit. I can specify how many, but I'm not required to. I also am not required to specify what kind of items are in my array. In some programming languages like processing or Java, you are required to say how many items are in the array when you construct your array, and you have to say what kind of items you're putting into your array. But in JavaScript, it doesn't care. We just say var planets equal, and then by using 2 square brackets, that designates that planets is an array object or variable instead of just a number or a string or whatever the case may be. So the square brackets are how we will constantly reference something as an array object. And then you will notice that the very first object in that array starts at position 0. Computers like counting from 0. So the first thing a computer counts is 0. and then the next item will be at 1, the next item is at 2. So when we can see that planets 8 is referring to the 9th item in my array, 0 through 8. And I still believe that Pluto is a planet, despite the astronomer telling me otherwise. I'm going to go with it that Pluto is part of my childhood list of planets and will forever have that place of honor. Looking at the array, I have my array planets equals square brackets that says planets is an array, and now I populated each item in that array. I could have also populated my array by saying planets, or if we do it as var planets is equal to, and now I can specify Mercury, and I'll just keep them short this time, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, etc. So we can now go through and specify, instead of at each position, we can just do it as a comma delineated list of elements. So this would be a different way that I could now populate my array planets. So when I look at this list, we can see that planets 0 is Mercury, but in this item, planets 0 is Mer, or if I spelled out, Mercury. So it's based on its position. The first item in that list is at 0. The next one is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when we want to access the items in our array, if we define our array with a comma list and want to know, well, I want to access Earth. Well, I could count 1, 2, 3. So then it would be at position 2 because it's the third item in the array. Or count 0, 1, 2. As long as I start counting from 0, then I don't have to take one off, and that works. So if you get used to always starting your counting from 0 when you're working on the computer, then you are getting one step closer to having your kind of neural human-computer interface, and we will get the little port put on the back of your skull, and we'll plug you in matrix style, and it'll be super awesome. But we still have the numbers associated with that position. When we construct an array and actually use the numbers and look at it in that manner, that sometimes makes it easier to find something later. If we use the comma delineated list, we may have to count to figure out which item is associated with which position in the array. And we'll see in a little bit there's even more ways we can add or subtract from an array. So we'll be taking a look at that. Now, continuing forward, I'm going to have a message that I'm going to be sending to myself. Our planets are, and now I want to cycle through my array so I can access it and write it on screen. So show you the output first, and then I'll explain what it does. So if I look at this, now based on what I've uncommented, I have a message, which was a variable up here. It started as an empty set of quotes, so it's just an empty string. Now I changed it to our planets are, and now I have this blah, blah, blah for loop, message plus equal blah, 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 and then we'll change the inner HTML or the text information inside my output paragraph and set it equal to message. So first, let's see what it does. So when I run it, we can see our planets are Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Sweet! We still get Pluto. Life is good. So what is happening here is I am taking advantage of what's called a for loop. And the for loop is a way that I can cycle through a list of items or do something repetitively until a condition is no longer true. There are different ways that we can loop inside programming. A for loop is one of the more common ones. A while loop is a different one that we can work with. I'm not a big fan of those, though in one of the samples I'll be playing with later on this afternoon, I actually used a while loop because it made sense to do that. So for me, that's big ground because I almost never use while loops. I always try and write things as a for loop. And I like writing my for loops in this manner where we start out where our for loop is going to run. So what happens inside the curly braces is going to run, and it will run based on this little variable I that we start out and say var I is equal to 0. And then this for loop will keep cycling through where it says I is less than planets.length. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then I plus plus. So what happens is I go into my curly braces, I do what's here, and then we follow the instructions of how to update our incrementer, or I, and plus plus it means add 1 to it. So I started at 0, then I becomes 1, and then we check to see if this condition is true. And if it's not true, then while it's true, then we keep doing what's here until it becomes not true. So once I is greater than or equal to the number of planets, then it will stop executing this code. So I'll trace it out in a little different format so we can see more specifically what is going on. Planets.length is a cool property that arrays have, which is we're able to, with an array, we can know how many items are inside that array. It's length, the quantity. So length is referring to quantity. How many things does that array hold? It's quantity. That's what length refers to. So I'm going to just change the message and output something else. And we'll just say message is equal to, actually let's just, now we'll do it up here, message so 0 is equal to I, 1 is equal to I, and we can see it cycled through 8 times where these numbers are, it's printing out what I currently is. So I put a break here so that it would dump it on to the next line. Now you will notice inside the quotation marks I then have the markup brackets and then a BR tag for a line break to dump things on to the next line. So that's a little, when you're constructing a string in JavaScript and then you're populating the inner HTML, you can use tags. So we could use an EM tag. We could use a strong tag. We can use a break tag. So we can actually construct fairly complex markup that we're then populating into our document. So then it's now showing me what that I equals. So the first time message or planets are, then it says plus equal, so it takes and adds to it a break, and then it will be 0 is equal to I. So if we look at what it did, our planets are, then 0 is equal to I, 1 is equal to I, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, after I go through this and I was 8, we add one more to it, 9. 9 is less than planets.length. Nope, because 9 is equal to planets.length, so then this for loop stops running. One thing when you construct a for loop is what you make has to at some point be able to become untrue, otherwise you can create a kind of a infinite loop, and at that point the computer gets very unhappy. So it will run for a while, and then usually you will get a message that comes up and says a script is causing this tab or this browser to become unresponsive. So if you've ever experienced that when you're surfing the web, it's because the script is usually run into an infinite loop situation where it now can't stop doing what it's doing, and then it causes your browser to go belly up. Now it is time for us to bid farewell to Pluto. So moving down in my document, I've commented out everything after my initial array here, which had objects 0 through 8, ending with Pluto. There's a method that we can use when we're working with arrays, and that is called pop. And what pop does is that removes the last element in an array. So we have a couple of array methods we'll look at. We have pop, we have push, and we have splice. These are the three most popular array methods that you will utilize. Pop says take whatever's at the end of the line and throw it away. Done. So I say planets.pop. And in the process of doing so, when I cycle through my planets, unfortunately now poor Pluto has met his demise, because we can see Pluto is no longer on the list. And that's a sad day. So no more Pluto. He died. Now, one other thing about dealing with pop is that when we look at pop, is it also can be set equal to, so when I create a variable, I say var, and I said nep, because it's going to be Neptune, is equal to planets.pop. What it does is it takes that last element that it just ejected from the array and now sets my variable object nep equal to it. So it's not uncommon when you're removing things from the array, it actually, in programming speak, it returns that element. So the technical definition of pop, not only does it slice off and throw out, or slices, I shouldn't use slice, but it cuts off the last item in the array, and then it gives it back to you if you want it. So it returns that item to you, and generally you will just discard it, but sometimes you use pop, pull it out of your array, and then now you do something else with it. So we may want to keep track of it. So then I can say the newest removed planet is Neptune. So if I run this, we'll see the newest planet removed is Neptune. All right. Now, just like pop, we have an item called push. And what push does is allows you to add an element to the end of the array. So now I'm pushing in the planet Vulcan. I figured, why not? I'm going to go beyond our solar system, but since, it was those Vulcans, they were the first, extraterrestrials that we were able to have intelligent contact with. It makes sense since, they apparently were closest to our solar system that we were able to, build that communication with those Vulcans. So we'll go with that. But now when I look at this and look at my planets, when I say push with Vulcan, we can see that it adds Vulcan to the end of the list. So Pluto is back because I'm now working with, again, a clean copy of my array. It doesn't remember it from document to document since I'm commenting out all of that pop information. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Vulcan. So our nearest extraterrestrial neighbor there that we can go hang out with, even if they're green-blooded and other such stuff. Moving on to splice. So splice is a really powerful way of working with it. And what we're able to do with splice is we're able to specify what position in the array we want to start at, and then we get to specify how many positions in the array we want to access, and then it removes them. So while pop allows me to grab something from the end of the list, splice allows me to grab something or multiple items from anywhere in the list, which makes it immensely powerful. So with splice, when I say 2, 1, that says grab the object at position 2, And let's just grab one thing for now. So now if I uncomment some code here so we can look at it. So I'm going to leave Vulkan in. I'll just comment this out because I like having Vulkan there. So now when I run it, there's 10 objects in my array, my original 9 planets plus Vulkan. And this is going to grab the item at position number 2. So when I look at this, we will notice that it goes Mercury, Venus, Mars. Something has now happened from the third rock from the sun. So splice removes the item at position 2. The item at position 2 was Earth. So we can see planets 2 is Earth. And it grabs one element. Now if I change this to, say, 3, that's going to grab Earth, Mars, and Jupiter. They should all disappear. So if I look at this, I'll see Mercury, Venus, Saturn. So Earth, Mars, and Jupiter have now disappeared. So I grab 3 objects from my array starting from position 2, knowing that position 2 is the third object in the array. In this case, it's the planet Earth. One of the other big advantages of using arrays is the fact that the items themselves don't actually need to have a name. I'm not naming the object, so I'm not saying planet number 1, planet number 2. I just take these planets, I put them into my array, and they reside at their respective correct position in the array. And we can access them by their position. So we don't have to give them names, because if we're building something where we have, like in a game where I would have an unknown quantity of enemies or projectiles or explosions or different things I'm working with, I don't want to have to think ahead of time of a whole bunch of names to associate with them. And if I'm going to have 10,000 things on screen, I make it a little computer-generated an explosion. It has 1,000 particles with it, so it creates that real kind of fine-grained, cool visual effect. I don't have to name each particle, particle 1, particle 2, particle 3, particle 4. All I do is say, I'm going to build my array. I will populate that array with these 1,000 particles, and then I can just access elements based on their position in the array, so we don't need to know anything about their respective names. It becomes a much easier proposition to keep track of. So that's one of the huge, huge, huge advantages of arrays. Looking at this document, we will see that inside it, inside the body, I have my headline, Electric Dreams. I have a paragraph, ID computer, an input ID human, and then my enter button. We'll also notice inside my input it has placeholder equals, type your response. So it does that so that when we view this document and it comes up, we see where it says type your response ... inside the input field. So it's giving us that little prompting without you having to put additional instructions. So that's handy. Now related to that, after we click on it, we're resetting the value back to empty. So as soon as we empty out the text that the user typed into that input field, it replaces it with that placeholder text. So, well, I'm looking at it. If I type something and then hit enter, it cleans it out and shows me what I typed up there. So right now the computer's not that smart. So I have paragraph ID computer, input ID human, and my enter button. I intentionally did not put ID on the button because I wanted to demonstrate the get elements by tag name command that JavaScript has available to it, so that we could understand a little bit more of how that works. So we can use document get element by ID. We've done that before. We have get elements by tag name. When we say get elements by tag name, we put the name of the tag we're looking for inside the quotation mark, and then we put, when we do that, what it does is it returns an array. In this case, there's one button on the screen, so it would give us that first object. But because it's returning an array, so get elements by tag name gives us an array, I also then put a little item after here, and I said, by the way, I want the first item in that array, which happens to be at position 0, because arrays always count from 0. So this would be the same as saying, hey, I want to go grab Mercury. That's planet 0. In this case, I'm grabbing my button array item 0. So we're able to, with get element, so anytime we have a get elements with a s, a plural, that means it returns an array. When we say get element, as in by ID, it returns that single entity. So that's the way to keep straight of, when you say get element, if it ends with element and it's single, you know you're getting one thing. But if it says get elements by tag name or by class name, which is another option we have, we can get elements, plural, by class name. And if we use that command, it returns all items of that specified class. Again, it returns it as an array, so to access a particular one, we would need to then use array notation. Once I have accessed my button object, I'm going to add an event listener to it using the click button or the click event. That will call the click handler function, and then we use the comma false. That's referring to the event capture phase, just accept for now that we're going to use comma false and just roll with it. If you want, again, go look up the event capture phase in JavaScript, and you can find all kinds of technical treatises on it that will give you all kinds of good bedtime reading if you're insomniac. So you can read through it as you're willing to do so. If I want to know the value of what was input, so when I click on the button, I can now access the value of what was input. Remembering human is the input field. So the human is where the person is typing. And then I'm modifying the computer's statement to keep adding whatever the human typed to it. So every time the human inputs information, it adds it to what the computer had there before. We're going to change that in a little bit. So every time I type something in, the computer is going to give me a response and start to develop a little bit of personality, a little bit of sass, a little bit of bad behavior. So if we look at this again, no matter what I type in, it shows up there. But I want the how are you today to go away. I don't want the computer to print out my response, but I want the computer to tell me something new when I click on it. So I'm going to help you through a little bit of the modifications to the code here, and then we're going to have you start to scratch your heads about how you can get the computer to start responding and use an array to be able to do that. So we'll take a look at that shortly. So what I'm going to recommend that we do is we still reset the input field to nothing, so then the placeholder text shows up again. And then we're going to change the computer's response, and instead of having it say this, so I'm just going to comment these two lines out. Actually, I'll comment them out, and then we'll add something else in instead. I'm going to say computer inner HTML is equal to response. So what we have to do is figure out what that response is going to be and how we can randomly access that. And to give you just a little bit of extra help as you're going to work through this, response is going to be equal to math.floor math.random times, and this is where we get to figure out something, and we're going to say right now I want the computer to have a possibility of 2 responses. Yours can be more later, but let's start out with 2. So the computer is going to have an option of 2. And one other thing here. put square brackets around response in that line. So we're doing a little bit of math where we round down a random number between 0 and 2. So we have a random number, math.random gives me a random value of 0 to 1. I multiply that by 2, so now I have a number between 0 and 2, but not including 2. And then I round down. So then I'm either going to get possible values of 0 or 1. The magic trick here is if I'm getting values of 0 or 1, I remember that arrays start counting at 0. So that means I'm accessing the item at position 0 in my array or the item at position 1 in my array, realizing I only have 2 possible responses from the computer. So based on having this here, your challenge is to figure out how to build the array so that this can work with it. So adding the responses into my document, I have my array of responses. Now when you write out the array, if I do it as a comma list versus responses bracket 0 and my first response is bracket 2, I can do it as a comma delineated list where I do var responses equals square bracket, and then I have all of my responses where everyone has a comma after it except the last one. Now, if I put a comma after this last one, that will cause my script to get broken. And I'll be like, was it? But I look here and it looks about the same. A really common thing, whenever you have a comma list of items and you separate them onto multiple lines, you typically are like copy pasting between lines, so then you end up with a comma after your last one. You have to remember to delete that, otherwise it will haunt you. Many a programmer has forgotten that comma at the end of a comma list, and they put one final comma in because of the magics of copy pasting, and then they're up till 3, 4 in the morning going, why is my thing not working? And it's that one stinking comma. So making a big deal out of it because it is a big deal. Now I can add in as many other elements as I want, as long as the last one doesn't have a comma after it. And now something that I could do, and I forgot to include it before, I should have had a var here under my response. One thing about the word var in JavaScript, there's a few instances where you're required to have the word var when you define a variable. The majority of the time, if you don't do it, it works just fine. It's considered a better practice that you define your variables with the word var, so when you look at the code, you know, oh, this is where the variable is being instantiated or created. But it will still work even if you don't, except in a few select cases that are beyond the scope of where we're going this afternoon. So I forgot the word var when I wrote out the demo. You made yours work without the word var, but the word var, it's better to have it in there. Now, one thing I'm going to change is if we remember that now previously I'd said 2, we wanted 2 items in our array of responses. Well, if I want more responses than 2 and want to just keep adding them as I see fit with it and not have to remember to change this number here, I can remember that arrays have a property of how many items are in that array. So I can say responses dot, and then I can say length. Length is how many items are contained, how many things are in my array. That way, if I keep adding more to it, my program will keep working just fine. So this is how we can start to create a snippy, sarcastic, or mouthy, bratty, or congratulatory and friendly computer program, depending on how you choose to write it. So if you say complimentary things in here, then you could certainly do that as well. Or you could build a computer response with attitude.
All hail the almighty Google.
So adding in the keyboard part of it, what we need to do, right now we've told our button to listen for click. What I can also do is I can say window, because we don't tell the button to listen for the keyboard, we tell the window to listen for the keyboard, because the whole window accepts keyboard input. and then we're able to do something with it. So keyboard input isn't it's not an event that an image or a button or something listens for. It's the whole window listens for the keyboard. So window.add event listener, and the event we're listening for is key down, all lowercase. And then I will have a key down handler, like I have my click handler. And I repeated the key down, all lowercase, and then comma false for my event capture mode here. So I have a click handler function that's doing some stuff. And then I will have my key down handler. Now one difficulty when we're doing this is we recognize we're dealing with an input field that I'm typing text into, which every time I push a key on the keyboard, say to type text, that's a key down event that just occurred. So what we have to do is we have to specifically listen for the enter or return key on the keyboard. And the good part is all of the keys on our keyboard correspond to ASCII numbers, ASCII numbers. So there's a ASCII chart that corresponds to each key on the keyboard. Spacebar is 32, shift is 16. The arrow keys are 37, 38, 39, and 40 for left, up, right, down. And then we have the return or enter key, which corresponds magically to number 13. So this is a code that when I press any key on the keyboard, it generates a number code. The return or enter key gives me the number 13. So knowing that, we're going to be able to take advantage of that. So function key down handler. So define it, it's just a function. We're using a function declaration here, not a function expression. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be able to access. So we want to know in plain language, we want to say if the key code is 13. So this is not full programming speak yet. I'm just writing it down in plain language first. So if the key code is 13, then change the text stuff. So that's kind of the gist of what we want to have happen. Because right now when I click the mouse, it changes the text stuff. So I want when I click the key to change the text stuff. And we want to do it when the key code is 13, when the key down event happens when the browser window has focus. So in the browser window, which is listening for a key down, when it happens, calls my key down handler function. Key down handler says, hey, if the key pressed happens to be represented by the number code 13, then let's do what we're supposed to do. So that's the gist of what we're trying to do there. So I'm just going to comment that out and now write it properly. Now, to do this, we use our standard if statement and then get some curly braces. And then it will be do the text changing magic. And the text changing magic we can see is represented, of course, over here. So I'll let you worry about that. I'm going to worry about with you how we can populate what's inside these parentheses. So we need to say, okay, we want to know when the key code is 13. And key code is using camel case, K-E-Y, capital C-O-D-E. That's pretty critical that when we write out the word key code that the C is capitalized. The rest of it's all lowercase. And then we're able to say we want to know when it is equal to the number 13. So we use 3 equal signs to say when it is actually equal to that exact number. So when they are the same, in fact, items, 13. That tells us the entry key. Now, this is going to be really close to working, but not quite. There's a little bit more syntax that we have to worry about. So if I try and run this, and we'll look at it, and in my console inside the browser, it gives me a reference error, key code is not defined. It's like, key code is not defined, except I just told you that key code is what we need to do. And the reason it's not defined is key code is a property of the event that has just occurred. So we need to reference the event of pressing the key itself and then capture whatever key code is associated with that key down event. So the easy way of doing it is we need to put something inside the parentheses here. Some people like to just use the word E to represent the event, and then you do E.keycode. Some people like to use EVT, and then you write EVT. And some people like to write event. Now, all three are correct. All three work just fine. And you can determine which of the three methods you like. I count 5 letters here, 5 letters here, that's 10 letters versus 2. The fewer letters I type while I'm writing code usually translates into the fewer amount of typos I can make when I'm writing my code. Therefore, if I have a choice of brevity while still being readable, I prefer to use that. So I personally like to just reference, when it's an event-based item, I reference that event by the lowercase letter e. And then inside the curly braces of that function, I'm able to reference that same event by that letter E. So when the key down event occurs and the window hears it, it's now passing in that specific key, E. And then it says, hey, if the key you pressed has a key code of 13, then do something. So now if I run this, I won't see anything happen, but I also won't, there's no error messages. So I can go here and if I hit enter on the keyboard, nothing happens yet because I'm not saying to do anything yet.